Ethan had been stationed on the colony planet for months, doing what he had been trained to do: maintain peace. The planet was rich in resources, but the relationships between humans and the native species were still fragile. He had grown used to the quiet, the long days of patrol, and the strange mix of alien cultures. One morning, as he made his way through the dense jungle, his boots sinking slightly in the soft, wet earth, something unusual caught his attention. A soft sound, like a low groan, echoed through the trees. Ethan stopped, instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. He wasn't alone. Carefully, he moved toward the noise, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. Mind raced through all the things: it could be an animal, a trap, or worse, an ambush. But then he saw her. Lying on the ground, half hidden by the thick ferns, was a woman. Not just any woman, but an alien woman. Her skin was a pale, almost silvery blue, and her long, dark hair lay in tangled strands around her head. She was breathing heavily, and it was clear that something was wrong. Her legs were twisted at an unnatural angle, the unmistakable signs of serious injury. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary encounter. She was from one of the warrior races known for their strength and deadly skills in battle. The last thing he had expected to find today was an injured member of one of the most feared species in the galaxy, stranded and vulnerable. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. His training told him to stay cautious, to avoid getting involved. But the human part of him couldn't ignore her pain. He knew the danger of helping someone like her, but he couldn't leave her here. "Are you ... okay?" he asked, his voice low and careful. The woman's eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment there was only fury in her gaze. She tried to move but gasped in pain and quickly fell back onto the ground. The wound on her legs was deep, and blood soaked through the fabric of her tunic. "Stay back," she growled, her voice hoarse. "I don't need your help." Ethan could feel the weight of her words, and he knew the history between their species. Humans and her kind had never gotten along, but there was no time to argue. The jungle was a dangerous place, and she was in no condition to defend herself. "I'm not leaving you here," Ethan said, stepping closer but keeping his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Let me help you." The alien woman looked at him as if she were weighing her options. She was a warrior, a member of a fierce species that valued strength and independence. But here, in her moment of weakness, she had no choice but to accept his help. With a deep sigh, she nodded once, sharply. "Do what you must, human." Ethan knelt beside her, quickly assessing the injury. Her legs were badly broken, and it would take more than basic first aid to fix her. He glanced around, spotting a small medkit hanging from his belt. "I need to stabilize you first," he said, his hands moving swiftly to open the kit. "Carry you like this." She didn't argue, but her eyes remained filled with distrust. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, let alone a human. But in that moment, she had no other choice. As Ethan worked, he couldn't help but notice how fragile she seemed, despite the power and strength that her kind was known for. Her breathing slowed as he wrapped the broken parts of her legs in splints, but her face remained impassive. She didn't speak, only staring into the distance as if willing the pain to vanish. Once he had finished, he stood up, offering her a hand. "I'll get you back to my base. You'll be safe there." For a long moment, she didn't move. Ethan was about to speak again when she finally looked at him, her piercing eyes studying him carefully. "You risk your life for a warrior who has been trained to kill your kind." Her voice was still thick with pain, but there was a hint of something else. Confusion? Perhaps. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'm not doing this for your kind. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." She looked at him, her gaze softening just slightly. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, but Ethan caught it. For the first time, the walls between them seemed to lower, even if just a little. "I don't need your charity," she said, her tone defiant, even in her current state. "I'm not offering charity," Ethan replied. "I'm offering help. That's all." She took a deep breath, as if summoning the strength to speak again. "What's your name, human?" "Ethan," he replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. Zara, she said, almost as if testing the name on her tongue. Zara of the Kothan. Ethan. And Zara, he repeated. Let's get you out of here. With her legs bound and her injuries stabilized, it wasn't easy, but they managed to make their way out of the jungle. Zara had never been one to ask for help, and she wasn't about to show weakness now. But with every step, she leaned a little. More on Ethan, the human who had defied her expectations. They didn't speak much as they walked. Zara's pain was evident, and Ethan's thoughts were filled with uncertainty. He wasn't sure what would happen once they reached the base. Would she'll be accepted there? Or would the others view her as a threat? But for now, he was just focused on getting her to safety. Zara, despite her fierce pride, was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, not all humans were the enemies she had been taught to fear. As they continued through the dense foliage, both of them found an unspoken understanding. They weren't enemies anymore. They were simply two people in a strange world trying to survive together, and that in itself was a new beginning. Ethan moved carefully, keeping an eye on the trail ahead as well as on Zara, who walked beside him. Her steps were slow and cautious, but she seemed to be getting a little stronger with every passing hour. Despite her injuries, there was a fire in her that couldn't be extinguished, something that intrigued him, even though he didn't fully understand it. They'd been walking for hours through the dense forest, a mix of strange trees and thick underbrush that made every step a challenge. Zara's pace was still slow, but she was determined. There was something about her, something fierce and proud, that Ethan couldn't ignore. How much further? She asked, her voice rough from the effort. Ethan glanced around, trying to get his bearings. He didn't want to risk taking them too far. Off track. We're not far. There's a small human outpost nearby. It's not much, but you'll be safe there. Zara didn't say anything at first. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. For a moment, Ethan wondered if she was just humoring him, trying to tolerate the human she was forced to depend on. But as they walked, he started to notice small changes the way she looked at him. The way her movements became a bit less guarded. She wasn't completely comfortable yet, but she was trying. And for some reason, that made Ethan feel like maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. I never thought I'd be in a position like this, Zara said suddenly, her voice quieter now. Needing help from a human? It's strange. Ethan glanced over at her, surprised by her words. The warrior race she came from, the Kothan, had always seen humans as weak. They fought to survive, and their way of life was built around strength and dominance. To them, humans were an afterthought, a species that didn't stand a chance in the harsh galaxy they lived in. I didn't expect to be here either, Ethan said with a small chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. Not like this, at least. What? Glanced at him, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They walked for another hour before they reached the outskirts of the outpost. The small stone buildings were simple and worn, a reminder of how long humanity had been out here, far from Earth. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for now. As they entered the outpost, the few humans who were there looked up in surprise. They weren't used to seeing someone like Zara, an alien, especially one from a species that was often seen as hostile. Ethan could feel their eyes on them, but he didn't care. He was determined to get her the help she needed. Stay here, he said to Zara, pointing to a bench against the wall. I'll get you some water and a blanket. Zara didn't argue. She sank onto the bench, her exhaustion catching up with her. She was in pain, and her pride made it hard for her to admit how much she needed help. But the truth was, she didn't know how much longer she could keep going. As Ethan walked away to fetch supplies, Zara looked around the small room, the humans. Here had lived on this colony for years, carving out a life in a place that was far from home. She had been taught to see them as weak, inferior even. But as she sat there, she couldn't deny the quiet resilience she saw in their eyes. She had spent so many years thinking that only strength mattered, that only power was worth something. But now as she sat here, wounded and vulnerable, she was starting to realize that maybe there was more to strength than she had been taught. When Ethan returned with a blanket and a canteen of water, Zara hesitated for a moment before accepting. Both. She didn't want to be weak, but her body demanded it. Thank you, she said, her voice quieter than before. It wasn't much, but for Zara, it was a step forward. She had never said those words to anyone before, especially not to a human. Ethan smiled as he handed her the blanket. No problem. Just rest for a bit. We'll figure things out. Zara looked at him, her gaze softening. She had never imagined a human would treat her like this. Not like a monster, not like an enemy, but like someone worth saving. She had always been taught to expect nothing less than contempt from the humans, but here, Ethan had given her nothing but care and understanding. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady. Ethan sat beside her, glancing at the others in the room who were busy with their own tasks. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "We're not all warriors. Some of us just want to help." Zara looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the quiet determination in his eyes, the way he had carried her through the jungle, and the way he spoke now, not as a soldier, but as a person who wanted to make a difference. For the first time since their encounter, Zara felt something unfamiliar stir within her gratitude. It was a strange feeling, but it was there, and she couldn't deny it. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the noise of the outpost fading into the background. They were both so different, and yet, for this moment, they were bound by something greater, the simple act of kindness. As the hours passed, Zara found herself more and more willing to let her guard down, if only just a little. Ethan didn't judge her for her past or her race. He didn't treat her like an enemy or a monster. He treated her like someone who mattered, and as the darkness of the night settled over the colony, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of her world alone anymore. The next day, Ethan woke up to the sounds of distant birds and the rustling of leaves. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light over the small outpost. Zara was already awake, sitting by the window, her eyes scanning the outside world as if preparing for something. Ethan watched her for a moment, unsure of what to say. It was clear she was in pain, but her pride didn't allow her to show it. He stood up and stretched, then approached her, holding out a small package of food. "You should eat," he said gently. Zara looked at the food but didn't immediately take it. "I don't need your charity," she said, though her voice was quieter than before. It wasn't the same harsh tone she had used when they first met. Ethan raised an eyebrow, not surprised by her response. He had seen the pride in her eyes since the first moment they met, and he knew that would take time to break down. Still, he wasn't giving up. "You're not going to get better if you don't eat," Ethan said, his tone firm but kind. He sat down beside her, trying to meet her eyes. "We're in this together. Shh. You can't fight alone forever." Zara finally took the food from him, though she did it reluctantly. "You don't understand," she murmured as she slowly unwrapped the small bundle. "I have never needed anyone. I was always taught to be strong, to stand alone." Smiled softly, leaning back against the wall. "I get it. I was taught the same way. But sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes you need someone to help you." For the first time, Zara seemed to hesitate, looking down at the food in her hands. She didn't respond to his words, but the silence spoke volumes. She ate slowly, the action small but significant. By midday, they decided it was time to move. They couldn't stay in the outpost forever, not when there was a dangerous jungle. Outside and enemies lurking in the distance, Zara's legs were still healing, but she was determined to get stronger. She wasn't going to let weakness define her, not even now. Ethan packed what little they had, making sure to bring the essentials: food, water, and a few medical supplies. He knew they couldn't stay in the outpost much longer, especially since they had no idea when the next threat would arrive. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Ethan asked, looking at Zara as she stood up, still wobbling slightly on her feet. "I've fought worse battles than this," she replied with a determined look in her eyes. "I can do this." Ethan couldn't help but admire her resolve even. If it was a bit overconfident, still he knew that he couldn't let her face it alone. He had to be there, even if it meant carrying her again when she couldn't stand. The jungle was thick and dark, the trees towering overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, and the sounds of distant creatures filled the silence around them. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would want to get lost in, but they had no choice. They were on the run, and the only way to survive was to keep moving. As they made their way deeper into the jungle, Ethan could feel the tension between them easing. Zara was quieter now, not as defensive as she had been the day before. They walked side by side, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft, damped ground. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You can rest. I'll carry you if I have to." Zara looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not some fragile human who needs to be carried." Ethan smiled, half amused and half concerned. "I know that. But you're not invincible either. If you need rest, it's okay." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked ahead, her face set in determination. After a long moment, she spoke. "I don't want to be weak. I've always been taught that weakness is the enemy. It's what gets you killed." Ethan nodded, understanding more than she knew. "I used to think the same way. But sometimes, being strong means knowing when to lean on someone else. It doesn't make you weak, it just makes you human." Zara didn't respond to that, but there was a flicker in her eyes. Ethan could tell she was thinking about it, and that was all he needed. They didn't have to agree on everything, but at least they were starting to understand each other. The journey through the jungle was harder than either of them had expected. The air grew thicker, the plants denser. They had to fight their way through sharp thorns and creeping vines that seemed to grab at their legs like they didn't want them to leave. But every time they hit a new obstacle, they worked together to overcome it. Zara helped Ethan in ways he didn't expect, showing him how to move quietly, how to avoid traps, and how to fight off the smaller predators that lurked in the shadows. Wasn't easy, but it was better than being alone. As night began to fall, they found a small clearing in the jungle. They set up camp, making a small fire to ward off the cold and any potential threats. Ethan sat down beside it, looking out at the dark jungle around them. Zara sat a little farther away, her eyes distant, lost in her own thoughts. Ethan could tell she was struggling with something, but he didn't press her. He knew that she wasn't ready to open up fully yet, as they sat there. The crackling of the fire, the only sound between them, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace he'd expected when he signed up for the mission. But in that moment, surrounded by the unknown dangers of the jungle, and with Zara beside him, he realized that maybe peace wasn't about avoiding danger. Maybe it was about knowing that, no matter what, they were no longer alone. Zara looked up, her eyes meeting his for a moment. For the first time, she didn't look at him with distrust. She simply nodded, as if to say that she understood. And for a brief moment, Ethan knew that they had both come a long way from where they started. They had survived the jungle so far, and maybe, just maybe, they would survive it together. The night passed quietly, but the jungle around them remained full of life. The sounds of distant creatures echoed in the dark, and every rustle in the trees seemed to remind Ethan that danger was never far. He sat by the fire watching the flames dance while Zara rested against a nearby tree, her eyes closed, but her posture tense. Ethan could see how much she was holding back, how much pain she was trying to ignore. Despite her strong will, the injuries from the crash were still taking their toll. He hadn't been able to do much more than stabilize her legs, and he knew that time was running out. She needed real medical attention soon. As the fire crackled, he stood up and walked over to where Zara was sitting. He had an idea. "I think it's time we move on," he said, his voice low but firm. "The jungle's not safe, especially with your injuries." Zara opened her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that told Ethan she wasn't entirely convinced. "Where would we go?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "There's nowhere safe out here for me." Ethan could feel the weight of her words. He knew that the Kothan, her people, were ruthless. They didn't show mercy, and they would not be kind to someone who had been injured or was seen as weak. For them, strength was everything. And right now Zara was. "Far from strong, there's a small human settlement to the north," Ethan said, offering her a reassuring smile. "I've been there before. It's not much, but it'll be safer than staying out here." Zara seemed to consider his words for a long moment, her eyes searching the darkness as if weighing her options. Finally, she nodded, her voice steady. Despite the uncertainty, "I'm not a burden, Ethan," she said. "I won't drag you down." Ethan sat down next to her, shaking his head. "You're not a burden. We're in this together. You don't have to carry this alone." Zara's lips pressed together, and for the first time she didn't argue. She simply looked at him, as if for the first time beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight everything on her own by the time they packed up and began walking again. The sun had risen, casting a pale light through the canopy. They moved quietly through the jungle, their footsteps muffled by the thick leaves and underbrush. Ethan kept an eye out for predators, but it was clear that the jungle was far from empty. He could feel the eyes of unseen creatures watching them. Waiting for an opportunity, Zara was quieter than usual, her face tight with concentration as she walked beside him. She was still in pain, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Every step she took was a reminder of how far she had come and how far they still had to go. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the atmosphere began to change. As the air grew thicker, the trees taller, and the ground beneath them more uneven. The dense underbrush seemed to close in on them, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They had been walking for hours when Ethan suddenly stopped. Going to his sidearm, Zara noticed the change in his posture immediately. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low and alert. Ethan's eyes scanned the surroundings, his senses on high alert. "I don't know," he muttered, looking at the trees ahead. Something felt off. The air was still, too still. And then he heard it, the faintest sound, a snap of a twig breaking, barely audible over the sounds of the jungle. He didn't hesitate. "Get down." Ethan shoved Zara to the ground and dropped to his knees, his weapon drawn. From the corner of his eye, he saw shadows moving quickly, figures blending into the jungle. He cursed under his breath. It was a group of Kothan warriors, Zara's people. Before he could react, one of the warriors emerged from the shadows, a spear in hand aimed directly at Ethan. The warrior's eyes glowed with the same fierce energy that had been in Zara's when they first met. The look of a predator. "Stay down," Zara hissed, her voice cold as she pushed herself up from the ground, ignoring the pain in her legs. She looked at Ethan, her expression hardening. "I'll handle this." Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. "You're not in any condition to fight." "I don't have a choice," she replied, her eyes flashing with determination. "They'll kill us both if we don't fight." Zara pushed herself up again, more slowly this time. Ethan's grip tightened around her wrist, but there was no stopping her. She was a warrior, and her instincts were too strong. He could see it in the way her body tensed, ready for battle, even if she could barely stand. The Kothan warrior raised his spear, advancing on them, his eyes locked on Zara. But before he could strike, Zara moved in a blur, her body swaying with incredible speed. She grabbed the spear mid-thrust, twisting it out of the warrior's hands and knocking him back with a powerful kick. Ethan stared in awe as she took down the warrior with a single move, her strength and agility unmatched. The others hesitated, for a moment, clearly unsure of what to do. But then the sound of more movement came from behind them. Reinforcements. Zara was breathing heavily, but her expression remained fierce. "We need to go," she said quickly, turning toward Ethan. "There are more coming. We don't have time." Without another word, they took off, weaving through the dense jungle, moving quickly, knowing the warriors wouldn't stop until they caught them. The sound of pursuit was growing louder, and the jungle seemed to close in around them. As they ran, Zara's thoughts raced. Her people were after her, and they weren't going to stop until they finished what they had started. She had known this day might come, but it didn't make it any easier. She had betrayed them by showing weakness, and now she had to face the consequences. But she wasn't alone this time. Ethan was with her, and for the first time. She wasn't carrying the weight of the world by herself. "Stay close," Ethan called, pulling her along faster. Together, they ran through the jungle, both of them fighting for survival, both of them fighting for each other. The sound of pursuit grew louder. Zara and Ethan ran through the thick jungle, their footsteps muffled by the soft ground. but the crashing of branches and snapping of twigs behind them was unmistakable. The Kothan warriors were relentless, and it was clear that they wouldn't stop until they caught Zara. Ethan glanced over at her as they ran side by side. Her face was set with determination, but there was a hint of pain in her eyes. She wasn't as fast as she had been before, her injuries still slowing her down. Ethan knew they had to get to shelter, or they would be caught. "You're not going?" "To make it at this pace," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "We need to find somewhere to hide." Zara didn't respond, her focus on the path ahead. She was trying to push past the pain, but Ethan could see it in her every movement. She was struggling, and they were both running out of time. Ahead of them, the jungle opened up into a small clearing. Ethan's heart raced as he scanned the area for cover. There was a small, rocky outcrop to the left, partly hidden by thick vines and trees. It was their only option. "Over there?" Ethan shouted, pointing toward the rocks. "Go!" Zara nodded. Not wasting time, and they sprinted toward the cover. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, and Ethan knew they didn't have much time. They reached the rocks and ducked behind them, trying to stay as still as possible. The jungle around them felt eerily quiet, the only sound the heavy breathing of both humans. Zara leaned against the cool stone, her hands gripping the edge as she tried to steady herself. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice tight. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The warriors would be on them soon, but they had one advantage. They knew the terrain. And the Kothan didn't. If they could remain hidden long enough, they might be able to escape. Zara closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Her species was known for their strength, their speed, and their ruthless efficiency in battle. But even they weren't immune to exhaustion. She had always been taught that weakness was something to be feared, something to hide from others. But now, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. Ethan was with her, and for the first time, she didn't have to pretend to be invincible. "We're not dead yet," Ethan said quietly, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "Now we can do this." Zara opened her eyes and looked at him. Shh. Could see the determination in his expression, the same determination that had driven him to help her when no one else would. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. They stayed behind the rocks for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the jungle and the distant calls of their pursuers, the warriors. Were searching the area, but they hadn't found them yet. Ethan and Zara knew it was only a matter of time before the Kothan realized they weren't in the clearing anymore. Zara felt her strength waning, but she refused to let it show. She had to stay strong. She had to stay alive. A tone might see her as weak, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall. Ethan turned to her, his voice low. "You need to rest. I'll keep watch." Zara shook her head, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. "I'm fine," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. "Can't stop now. They'll find us if we do." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. He wasn't going to argue with her, but he could see how much she was struggling, and it worried him. They had no idea how long they could keep running. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps reached their ears, soft but deliberate. They were getting closer. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't move. He could feel the heat of Zara's body next to his, her breath quick and shallow. She was still too weak, and they both knew it. Ethan's mind raced. He had to do something. He couldn't let her face this alone. Without thinking, he grabbed Zara's arm and pulled her to her feet. "We can't stay here," he whispered urgently. "Follow me." They moved quickly, ducking under the thick vines and trees, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest as he led them through the jungle, his mind racing with strategies and plans. But there was no time for thinking. All he could do was keep moving, keep going forward. Behind them, the Kothan were closing. Zara's breathing was heavy, and Ethan could hear her struggling to keep up. Her strength was fading, and Ethan could feel the weight of her body slowing down. She was too injured to keep running like this for much longer. "Hold on," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "We're almost there." Zara nodded, though she didn't have the strength to say anything. Her legs were screaming in pain, and her body felt like it was betraying her, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. They reached a small river, the water flowing quickly over the rocks. The current was strong, but it was their only option. Ethan grabbed her hand, helping her step into the water. "We'll cross here," he said, his voice urgent. "Stay close." Zara nodded again, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The cold water was a shock to her system, but it helped clear her head. She focused on the sound of Ethan's voice, the way his hand held hers firmly. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. They crossed the river quickly, the sound of rushing water masking their movements. Ethan led them to the other side, but the moment they stepped onto the bank, the sounds of their pursuers grew louder. The Cawthon were close. Very close. Ethan looked at Zara. "We have to keep moving. Stay with me." Zara gave him a small, determined nod, pushing past the pain and exhaustion. She didn't know if they could outrun the Cawthon, but for the first time she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the world on her own. Ethan was with her, and that gave her strength she never thought possible. Together they ran, pushing through the dense jungle, ready to face whatever came next, because this time they wouldn't face it alone. The jungle around them grew denser as they ran. The sound of their pursuers was getting closer, but for once, Ethan didn't feel the usual panic rising in his chest. Instead, there was something else, something stronger. Ikabuda. Weight of Zara's hand in his, and it was the only thing keeping him focused. "Stay close," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Zara was still with him. She was, her face set in determination, though she looked like she was struggling to keep up. They had crossed the river, but the Cawthon were relentless. The warriors were fast, and their ability to track them through the jungle was something Ethan couldn't ignore. He was starting to think their escape might be impossible, but there was one thing he knew. He wasn't going to leave Zara behind. She was barely able to keep her balance, her steps unsteady from the injuries to her legs. Ethan could see the strain in her face, the way her body was pushing past its limits. He had to act, and fast. "There's a cave up ahead," he said, scanning the area ahead. "We can hide there." Zara looked ahead, her eyes narrowing as she tried to focus. She nodded without speaking, too tired to argue. They kept moving, their footsteps quick but careful, trying not to make a sound. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the thick foliage making it hard to see where they were going. As they approached the cave, Ethan pulled Zara inside, helping her to sit against the cool stone. The cave wasn't large, but it was enough to hide them for now. The entrance was hidden by thick vines and ferns, and the walls of the cave were rough but solid. Ethan leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. The jungle had been unforgiving, and they were both exhausted, but he wasn't about to stop. Not now. Zara sat across from him, her back against the cave wall, her breathing shallow and labored. She was staring at the ground, her face hard, but there was something different in her expression, something softer. Ethan could see the toll that the journey had taken on her, but she wasn't willing to show it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds in the cave were their breaths and the distant calls of creatures outside. But then Zara finally broke the silence. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why are you doing this? Why help me? You know I'm not one of your kind. I'm one of them." Ethan looked at her, surprised by her words. He had been wondering the same thing. Why had he helped her? What had made him risk everything too? Keep her alive when his mission was to avoid trouble with the Cawthon, not get involved with them. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't really know," he admitted. I guess, I guess, it just felt right. You didn't deserve to die out there, Zara. No one deserves that." Zara didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him, as if she was weighing his words carefully. It was clear that for her, trust didn't come easily. It wasn't just because of her people's history with humans. It was because she had spent so long believing that her strength and survival were all that mattered. But now, as they hid together in the cave, something was changing. She glanced away from him, her expression hardening again. "You still don't understand," she said softly. "You think that kindness makes us stronger? It makes us weak. My people." They don't value weakness. I'm not sure I can keep pretending that I do. Ethan watched her closely. He could see the internal battle she was facing. She had been trained her whole life to survive by her own strength, to never show vulnerability, to never rely on anyone else. And here she was, sitting in a cave with him, someone she had always been taught to distrust, even hate. I don't think kindness makes you weak, Ethan said gently. I think it makes you stronger in ways strength can't. You've been through so much, Zara, and you're still here. That's not weakness. That's survival. Zara didn't respond, but Ethan saw her eyes flicker, the walls she had built around herself beginning to crack. He didn't know if he was getting through to her, but he hoped so. The idea of relying on others, of letting someone in, was something Zara had never considered. But maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see it differently. A loud noise outside broke their silence. The warriors were close, much closer than before. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he stood up, motioning for Zara to follow him. There was no time to waste. Cathan were almost upon them. We need to go, he said urgently. Stay low. We'll move fast. Zara nodded, standing up with his help. She was moving slower now, but there was a new strength in her eyes, a new resolve that hadn't been there before. They didn't have time to talk anymore. They had to act. They exited the cave and moved quickly through the dense jungle, trying to stay out of sight. The Cathan were still hunting them, but this time, Ethan wasn't going to let them catch up so easily. He knew the jungle better than most, and he used every trick he knew to stay ahead of their pursuers. As they moved deeper into the jungle, Zara's pace began to slow again. Ethan noticed her faltering and grabbed her arm to steady her. Don't push yourself too hard, he said, his voice filled with concern. We'll find a way out of this, I promise. Zara met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. She didn't seem afraid of showing him the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. I'm not afraid, she said, her voice steady, but I'm not going to let them win. Not again. Ethan smiled, relieved that she was finally starting to understand. It wasn't about fighting alone anymore. It was about fighting together. And that, in itself, was more powerful than anything. They kept moving, the sounds of their pursuers growing fainter behind them. Ethan didn't know how long they could keep this up, but he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, he wasn't leaving her behind. They were in this together.